This is The World This Weekend. Good evening, I'm James Murray. Tonight, BC port workers reject a second back-to-work deal, with the federal government saying all options are on the table. Also tonight, as the EU ends security cooperation to Niger following a military coup, experts warn there may be others willing to offer support to the strategically important country.
There is a risk here that cutting off Niger completely would drive it into the arms of other people. General Prigozhin of the Wagner Group has already offered his support.
And how a fast fashion juggernaut wants to beat Amazon at its own game.
Shein certainly seems to be getting Amazon a run for their money.
That's later. But first, there are new developments in this week's long labor strife on BC's ports. This afternoon, Federal Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan issued a directive to the Canada Industrial Relations Board, ordering it to look into the sticking points in the ongoing job action. This comes after the union representing port workers rejected a mediated offer for the second time. Benit Brach is covering this for us from Vancouver. Benit, let's start with that directive from the Labour Minister. What can you tell us about that?
James, Canada's Minister of Labour has a clear message. The economy can't take more billions in hits. He's now ordered the Canada Industrial Relations Board to determine if a negotiated resolution in the port dispute is no longer possible. And if a resolution is not possible, the board has been ordered to impose a new collective agreement or a final binding arbitration on both the port workers and their employers. This is the second time the board has gotten involved. On July 19th, port workers returned briefly to the picket lines. The board said that the strike was illegal with not enough notice and ordered an end to the strike as well.
Now, O'Regan says the federal government is prepared for all options. So what happens next?
Well, some of the big questions is if the government will use the back-to-work legislation. Essentially, it orders an end to strikes and imposes a settlement. For more on this now, we spoke to Liam McHugh-Russell. He's an assistant law professor at Dalhousie University.
There are charter constraints on the government intervention into the collective bargaining process, with collective bargaining being a guaranteed charter right. But courts have been somewhat okay with government interventions, depending on what form that back-to-work legislation takes and what kind of quid pro quo or alternative government puts in place if they do take away the power of the union to strike.
And the union has not yet issued another strike notice, which would follow further picketing and a suspension of work. Now, overall, there's been lots of turbulence from port workers and their employer, the BC Maritimes Employment Association. The employer said it is disappointed. It calls it a good deal that recognized the skills of port workers. One of the points in the deal was a 19.2% increase that potentially increased median compensation from $136,000 to $162,000 annually. That doesn't include pension. Meanwhile, port workers have been consistent on their demands, which include protection from automation, contracting out, and cost of living.
All right, Benit Brach on the Labour File tonight. Thanks for this.
You're welcome.
The streets of Charlottetown were packed today as PEI's largest ever Pride Parade made its way through the city. There had been questions about whether politicians should be allowed to attend the event, but as Stacey Genzer reports, despite the debate, a high-profile guest was welcomed to walk alongside the LGBTQ community.
It was a special Pride event in Charlottetown this afternoon. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau joined in on the parade. He followed the Mi'kmaq Heritage Group and took photos and shook hands with a welcoming crowd. Some walking in the parade chanted, "Protect trans kids." Building to today's parade, there had been some controversy around having politicians join in at all. In March, during the provincial election, Pride PEI said it no longer welcomed politicians after a taped private conversation about the trans community between Premier Dennis King and a voter caused an uproar. King did apologize, but Pride PEI said if politicians wanted to march, they need to show they'll be supporting the community all year. Tyler Murnian is the executive director for Pride PEI.
And we've been really, met with a lot of warm reception, so you would have seen a lot of politicians participating, but maybe a little bit different than you would have seen in the past. A little less party color, a little more pride.
The mayor of Charlottetown and some elected officials marched without any party representation. Lucky Fuska with Pride PEI says they checked with local LGBT organizations to ensure they wanted Trudeau to be a part of it.
And we really wanted to uplift the BIPOC and the Indigenous Mi'kmaq community here and their voices. So once we heard back that the folks that were representing those organizations or as individuals, seeing somebody that is in a leadership role that's showing up to show active allyship, they felt that that was very significant.
After the parade, Trudeau made his way down to Peaks Quay, a tourist spot on the waterfront, to meet with more people. There were two who shouted traitor but quickly left the area. Pride PEI events continue into Sunday. Stacey Janzer, CBC News, Charlottetown.
To Niger now, where the leaders of a military coup risk becoming increasingly isolated from the West. The U.S., France, and the European Union are threatening to cut off aid to the West African country unless those behind the coup stand down. Niger's elected president remains detained. As Philip Lishanuk reports, there are concerns about what could happen if foreign aid comes to an end.
In the Niger capital, Niamey, it was relatively quiet today. This week, there are violent demonstrations after military leaders announced they'd overthrown the democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum. But there are also rallies by those who support the military regime. Countries that are members of the African Union, including neighboring Nigeria, are calling for the return to civilian rule and for the soldiers to return to their barracks. Professor Bola Akintarinwa teaches at the Bolatag Center for International Studies in Lagos, Nigeria.
The government of Nigeria is not likely to accept negotiation with the unconstitutional government that is being put in place.
But he's worried about what the international community will do.
So if with the current situation, you cut off humanitarian aid, that will be worse thing.
We are calling for the immediate release of President Bazoum, calling for the immediate restoration of the democratic order in Niger.
On a stop in Australia, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said allies will cut aid if necessary.
Our economic and security partnership with Niger, which is significant, hundreds of millions of dollars, depends on the continuation of the democratic governance and constitutional order.
Professor Nick Westcott teaches in the School of African Studies in London and was the British ambassador to Niger between 2008 and 2011. According to the World Bank, Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world and receives close to $2 billion a year in international assistance.
And so that would be a very severe blow if all that aid was withdrawn.
And he says cutting off that international aid could push Niger into the orbit of Russia.
There is a risk here that if cutting off Niger completely would drive it into the arms of other people. And General Prigozhin of the Wagner Group has already offered his support to the coup leaders.
Wagner military boss Yevgeny Prigozhin has been seen with delegates to the Russian-African summit this week in St. Petersburg, where he praised the leaders of the Niger military coup. While he did not claim any involvement, he called it a long overdue liberation from Western colonizers. And he says his private army is already active in the region and could help provide security against jihadist insurgents. Philip Lishanuk, CBC News, Toronto.
Millions of Shia Muslims around the world took to the streets to commemorate the holy day of Ashura. Thousands of worshippers in Karbala, Iraq, gathered to mourn at the shrine of Imam Hussein, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Other large ceremonies were also held in India, Yemen, and Iran. Hussein died in the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD, a conflict that cemented the divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Earlier this week, a shrine south of Damascus was hit by 2 bomb attacks, killing at least 6 people and injuring 20. The Islamic State has claimed responsibility for both attacks. This week, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif was in Gwadar, a port city in the country's southern western province of Balochistan, talking up his government's investments there. The province is rich in minerals and has significant oil reserves. China is investing heavily in boosting infrastructure for Gwadar, including $230 million for a brand new airport. The province is also home to a bitter, decades-long insurgency by Baloch separatists. Activists claim thousands of men have been killed or abducted by the state, leaving women in this conservative and patriarchal society little choice but to take to the streets and call for answers. Freelance reporter Abdul Sattar has more from Islamabad.
Families of missing people take to the streets in Balochistan's capital Quetta, chanting, "Recover the missing persons, resistance is alive, resistance is alive."
My father was abducted in 2009, and his mutilated body was found in 2011.
Dr. Mehrang Baloch joined the movement calling for the recovery of missing people in Balochistan after her father was illegitimately picked up by security forces. Activists in Balochistan claim tens of thousands of people have gone missing since 2006, when the province plunged into a separatist insurgency that continues to this day. They say bodies have been found in mass graves, some bearing signs of torture. Pakistan's Federal Commission of Inquiry on Enforced Disappearance says as of January of this year, only 445 people were missing in the province, far below local estimates. Khurram Ali, a political activist, traces the history of the conflict back to the 1950s.
Pakistan had annexed Balochistan forcibly without the consent of its people. Therefore, it has faced 3 armed conflicts with the Pakistani state. The current one is the longest and I think the most devastating.
Prominent human rights activist Iman Zainab Mazari says women have no choice but to take to the streets and protest.
It's taken away often the sole breadwinner of a family, compelling women to come out onto the streets with little children, protesting for safe recovery of their loved ones. It's left people as half widows. It's left daughters not knowing if their fathers are alive.
Yasmin Lahiri is a former member of Balochistan's assembly. She says the disappearance of the man has had large-scale consequences.
But it seems that the issue of enforced disappearance situation in Balochistan has radicalized women and politicized them.
My name is Hamideen Baloch.
Sami was only 10 years old when her father went missing. She says for women like her, not knowing what has happened to their loved ones is a form of torture.
The ensuing anguish, waiting and uncertainty is itself an expressible agony and a mental torture. In this situation of leaving your grieving family alone and leaving home where you are having financial problems.
14 years after her father's disappearance, Samideen Baloch says successive governments have failed to give her any answers.
Until to date, we have got nothing but false promises, false consolations and disappointments from them.
The Pakistani government is pushing ahead with securing even more foreign investment in Balochistan. This week, the government announced a deal with Saudi Arabia's oil giant Aramco for a new oil refinery. Abdul Sattar for CBC News, Islamabad.
July isn't quite over, but experts are already saying this month was the hottest month since records began. Average temperatures are so high, the UN Secretary General said this week, we are now in the era of global boiling. In Canada, buildings make up a significant percentage of our emissions, so retrofitting homes is an important step to help the country reduce its climate impacts. Rukhsar Ali reports on one Toronto nonprofit that's trying to fight the climate crisis and the labor shortage at the same time.
On the second story of a half-demolished home in Toronto, apprentice Doreen Hainza is learning on the job.
I'd never used this.
While the home gets an energy-efficient upgrade, it doubles as her training ground. She's part of a program called Building Up.
I'm in heaven with the wealth of knowledge that I'm getting right now.
Where most people train and employ people to run their business, we run our business to train and employ people.
Mark Cerberano started the nonprofit 9 years ago, hiring people with barriers to employment to learn construction. People like women and racialized folk, those who were previously incarcerated, or newcomers like Heinze. Building Up focuses on creating more sustainable homes.
There's a bunch of huge challenges that are happening simultaneously.
Challenges like a construction labor shortage, an affordable housing crisis, and climate change. Across Canada, social contractors like Building Up are trying to tackle all these issues. And that's by teaching green skills to the next generation of tradespeople.
Right here?
Yep.
Skills like installing water retrofits, bettering a building's insulation, and more.
One stat that I think is really useful to keep in mind is that 2/3 of the buildings standing today will still be standing in 2050.
Maya Papineau is a professor at Carleton University. She studies energy economics.
To meet our 2050 targets, that means that we're going to have to massively reduce the average CO2 that each dwelling and building produces. And that basically entails a very large retrofit project on a national scale. It has implications for needing an adequately trained workforce.
Partnering with other nonprofits and affordable housing providers, Building Up typically works on fixing low-income housing. But programs like it aren't able to keep up with the increasing demand for green training or sustainable homes on their own. University of Toronto professor Laura Tozer says these local programs need federal funding to grow and can help Canada reach its net zero targets.
So I think it's feasible to scale up a program like this across Canada. What's working well in the way that Building Up works is that they have a really good match between local priorities and local communities and the operation of the company. So I think you're looking for ways to kind of roll that out in really locally connected ways across the country.
Back at the semi-demolished home, Heinze and her mentor successfully remove an old window. And with that, the home is one step closer to housing a low-income family.
This has been quite fun. We're like
destroying things to make it better.
Yeah.
Ruxarli, CBC News, Toronto.
Chinese clothing brand Shein has already made fast fashion faster, producing thousands of styles at ultra-low prices and shipping them around the world. Now the company wants to build an online marketplace to rival Amazon. Experts warn those cheap products will come with a big environmental cost. Lauren Bird reports.
It's a rare in-person opportunity for Shein shoppers, browsing before buying.
It's affordable. The kids love the brand, the boyfriend, me, myself, and we're here to celebrate this happening today.
Hundreds lined up at a Montreal pop-up, all waiting for the chance to buy trendy clothing at dirt cheap prices.
It's cheaper. I can find everything I want.
This is Shein. Shein, founded in 2008, has sped up the fast fashion model. Known as ultra-fast fashion, it pumps out thousands of trendy new styles every day. Hugely popular for its $3 tops and $5 dresses.
We believe the beauty of fashion should be accessible to everyone.
And now it's adding a global online marketplace to its model. Businesses and third-party merchants can sell everything from appliances to homewares. But the company has faced scrutiny over its environmental impact. The fast fashion industry sends millions of tons of clothing waste to landfills every year. And Sheng Liu, a professor at the University of Delaware who studies the global textile and apparel industry, says an expansion like this could add to those problems.
There are a lot of concerns about how Shein it create this kind of culture which encourage consumers to keep purchasing cheap clothing and dump them.
Shein has become hugely popular with Gen Z shoppers who show off their Shein hauls on social media.
Hi guys, I have a huge Shein haul.
And it's that ability to leverage its engaged shoppers that could give it an advantage over competition like Amazon, says Elizabeth Klein, a fashion sustainability writer.
Shein certainly seems to be getting Amazon a run for their money.
Klein says this could make things trickier for people trying to become more conscious consumers.
Shein sort of feels like we're erasing a lot of really good work that is being done to improve fashion and make it easier for consumers to buy a piece of clothing without worrying that they're, harming someone on the other side of the world.
Its new marketplace has already launched in Mexico, Brazil, and the U.S. Shein didn't respond to CBC about when it will be available in Canada, but it's not alone. Other online platforms are growing in the space. E-commerce site Temu announced this month it's expanding, and TikTok is also creating a marketplace to sell made-in-China goods. Lauren Bird, CBC News, Toronto.
In a remote corner of Yukon sits an old trading post called Rampart House. It might not look like much, but it holds a special significance for the Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation, and that is now being recognized by the Yukon government. Community members made a special trip down the Porcupine River to celebrate the site's new historic designation. Cheryl Kawaja reports.
Fiddle music invigorates people gathered at Rampart House, who don't miss the chance to do some jigging, just as people did back in the 19th century. Vuntut-Gwitchin Chief Pauline Frost.
Can you only imagine what that was like 100 years ago? I think this is probably the people that are here today, and everyone, the dogs and the children that are running around and playing, and I can only imagine that's what it was like, right? Because it's bringing life back to this place.
Elder Lorraine Nitro's roots run deep here. Her mother grew up at this spot.
And this land, the Rampart House, is, the beginning for so many of our families.
Rampart House is about 80 kilometers downriver from the fly-in community of Old Crow. It's right on the border with Alaska. In the late 1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company set up the trading post, one of the first in the territory. It grew into a thriving village.
It was a gathering place for all the Gwitchin people from Alaska, for Vuntut-Gwitchin and our relatives in NWT.
The commemorative plaque.
The site is co-managed by the Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation and the Yukon government. When the Vuntut-Gwitchin signed land claims and self-government agreements 30 years ago, making Rampart House an official Yukon historic site was part of the deal. It's taken a while, but now it's official. About 50 people came to mark the occasion, heading out to the remote site on the Porcupine River by boat, and some elders by helicopter.
It's emotional. It's such a day to celebrate.
My family, on my mom's side and my dad's side, used to live here too, so I think it's just an amazing place. Right here.
Alan Benjamin jokes about jumping back and forth between Alaska and the Yukon. Back in the 19th century, the border was much more fluid, but that changed in 1867 when the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia. It put a line right through the Gwitchin communities and families.
Some of our people moved to Alaska, and some of us moved to Old Crow. They had a Gwitchin name for the border. Kianintai, mean strong rope. It's like they put a long rope to divide two countries. It caused a lot of problems in terms of hunting and fishing. And
the caribou and salmon, key to the Gwitchin way of life, don't recognize the border. Lorraine Nitro says neither does she.
We do not recognize that border because these lands, our ancestors lived in these lands and they connect us. We have a spiritual connection to the lands, to the animals, to the waters.
Chief Frost says she hopes to have more days like this at Rampart House.
Now we want to be able to, show the world. We want to introduce more, educate others, because this is who we are as Vuntut-Gwitchin, right? This is where we originated.
She says restoration of the site will continue, and now with a heritage designation, it will be preserved for generations to come. Cheryl Kawaja, CBC News, Rampart House, Yukon.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm James Murray. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. When you think of cities known for electronic music, your mind probably wanders to Paris, Ibiza, Chicago, and Detroit. But right across the river from the Motor City, musicians are using drum machines, samples, and synthesizers to form their own community. Nav Nanwa now on how Windsor, Ontario became a treasure trove of techno music.
This is the sound of music duo Mothers Against Drum Machines. On the surface, Anthony Gomez and Craig St. Clair are two average dads who work normal day jobs. One at the University of Windsor, the other in construction. But when the work week is over and the kids are asleep, both meet up in a basement studio and make techno music.
We came up playing music downtown, DJing. This was an opportunity for us to learn something new.
In the shadow of Detroit, which is called the birthplace of techno, Windsor has always danced to its own beat. Some of the biggest artists in the genre hail from Windsor, like Richie Hawtin, who's been leading the way in minimal techno since the 1990s.
Richie Hawtin!
His influence led to raves becoming a mainstay in the city.
2000, 2001, 2002, I would say that was the height of the scene for me. It died down for a while. You didn't really hear much until Boom Boom Room opened back up.
Venue closures and the pandemic led to the techno scene's decline. But with restrictions now gone, the movement is growing again. Justin James is one of the DJs leading the way.
The scene kind of comes and goes, but it's still alive and well in some level, because the most beautiful thing about this thing, the underground, is where it truly lives and will always live.
James has his own label called Refused and runs exclusive parties called Unknown.
I choose or find a venue and promote it, but don't let people know where it is till the day of the event, and they'll show up.
What James is doing is only a small part of what's going on today. Madeline Mazak is a local radio host known by the DJ alias Odessa.
You can find pockets in the city of places you can go to find people doing this stuff, and especially in the last year, I'd say I see so many more people promoting those events.
The burgeoning scene is also attracting people from outside of Canada.
We had a DJ named Klaus here from Cologne, Germany, on a Wednesday night once again, and I got to play with him, which is insane.
At the Signal Exchange meetup group, anyone with a drum machine can drop in and join a jam session. It is one way the music is creating a community, says co-organizer Cameron Doig.
We would just get together and talk about gear. It's always just been this sort of grassroots bunch of people that like music.
With so much going on, Craig St. Clair has cautious optimism that it'll ever become mainstream.
I don't know if he'll ever get back to that, but I don't think it needs to.
Whatever the future holds, you can count that the beat will go on. Nav Nanwa, CBC News, Windsor, Ontario.
Ready, 1, 2, 3, 4.
You heard Nav talking about the birth of techno on the other side of the Detroit River. This is what some of that birth sounded like 40 years ago in 1983. Techno legend Juan Atkins, who went by the name Cybertron, released this bit of music on vinyl and I think on cassette tape. This is Clear. A living, breathing example of what small groups can create. Atkins has spent decades behind the turntables, watching techno become EDM, electronic dance music, and watching that become a $5 billion a year market of music, giant clubs, underground warehouses, and beachside parties. Now, in his 60s, he's still playing. Juan Atkins headlined the recent large annual festival Movement in his hometown of Detroit. Despite techno's growth, Atkins says now, like then, it can be a struggle to get his new music heard.
I wish people were more open-minded, to accept more things like what I do. It's not enough to just say, oh, he's the creator of techno. I still don't fit that marketing model.
In case that went by you, the man credited with techno's birth says there are villains afoot in the genre he loves.
The marketers want it to stay conventional.
The marketers, boo marketers, says Juan Atkins, before hitting play on a track from this century, this decade in fact. We'll leave you with an immersive beat recorded live at Tresser, an underground techno nightclub in Berlin. You've been vibing with the world this weekend. I'm James Murray. Thanks for listening and moving along with us on this Saturday. Good night.